It started with a slap, a sharp, vicious crack that sliced through the humid, grease-laden atmosphere of the 24-hour diner like a thunderclap. It wasn't merely the sound of flesh meeting flesh. It was the sound of malice, of helplessness, of a boundary being shattered that could never be restored. And for the two young men in varsity jackets who delivered it, it marked the beginning of the most catastrophic night of their existence, though they were too conceited, too intoxicated by their own misguided arrogance to realize it yet. The Midnight Haven was a relic of yesteryear, a bubble of chrome, crimson leather, and buzzing fluorescent tubes caught in a neglected pocket of a small American town. It was a refuge for third-shift laborers, for the sleepless, for long-haul drivers navigating desolate interstates. And tonight, it served as the stage for a quiet, dedicated young woman named Emma. She navigated through the diner with a rehearsed, cautious elegance. Her pale blue uniform dress stood in sharp contrast to the darkness crowding against the rain-streaked windows. She was 23, but her eyes, the color of winter frost, carried a heaviness that aged her beyond her years. She topped off coffee mugs with a gentle, "Here you go, sir," and cleaned tabletops with a silent proficiency that reflected countless hours and scarce appreciation. She was the type of person who disappeared into the scenery, an image of quiet endurance that most people overlooked entirely. And then there were Tyler and Marcus. They burst through the door just past 10:30, a blast of frigid air and overbearing laughter announcing their arrival. Their high school varsity jackets, emblazoned with a bold T for the Titans, testified to glory days that were, for them, quickly fading into memory. They were college freshmen now, home for the weekend, but they still conducted themselves like royalty of the high school corridors. They crashed into a corner booth, their voices excessively loud, air presence and invasion. They were the tempest that had finally erupted inside the diner's warm sanctuary. They immediately targeted Miguel, the aged, hunched-over line cook, bellowing their convoluted, absurd meal requests through the kitchen window, cackling when he struggled to process their demands. They hurled mocking remarks at a young couple attempting to enjoy a peaceful moment together, making the woman flush crimson and avert her gaze to her plate. But their primary victim, the one who provided the least pushback and therefore the greatest entertainment, was Emma. From the instant she approached their table, notepad ready, they commenced their assault. "Well, what do we have here?" Tyler, the bulkier of the pair, drawled, his eyes surveying her in a manner that made her skin prickle with discomfort. "You're new around here, aren't you? Don't recall seeing a pretty little thing like you working this dump before." Emma maintained her focus on her notepad. "What can I bring you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Marcus snorted. "Gentlemen? You hear that, Ty? She thinks we're gentlemen." Their order was intentionally chaotic, a cheeseburger with everything except the lettuce, the tomatoes, the sauce, and the top bun. Cooked medium well, but not charred. Onion rings ultra crispy but not blackened. They altered their selections 4 times solely to observe her scribble and scratch out corrections, a petty, vindictive game for their entertainment. She tolerated it. She delivered their beverages, and Tyler accidentally knocked his glass of ice water onto the floor, the shattering glass making her flinch. "Oops, Butterfingers," he said with a smirk devoid of any remorse. "You gonna clean that up, darling?" Emma didn't respond. She simply crouched down, collecting the jagged, wet fragments with shaking hands, the frigid water seeping into the knees of her uniform. The other customers averted their eyes, a shared sense of shame permeating the atmosphere. They were observers of an injustice, but fear, or perhaps indifference, silenced them. Miguel, the cook, glowered from his station, his weathered hands balled into fists, but he was 72 years old and weighed maybe 120 pounds. There was nothing he could do. The genuine torment commenced when their meals arrived. Tyler took a single bite of his deconstructed burger and expelled it back onto the plate with theatrical disgust. "This is stone cold," he declared, his voice resonating throughout the space. "And I specifically said Medi." Well. This is practically raw. You serving me garbage, sweetheart? Emma, her complexion drained of color, stammered. I can have Miguel prepare you another one. You'd better, Marcus interjected, shoving his plate across the table. And these onion rings are limp. You think we're paying good money to consume this slop? Emma reached for the plates, her movements sluggish and defeated. But as her fingers made contact with Tyler's plate, he seized her wrist. His grip was vice-like, his knuckles bone-white. The diner descended into silence. The only sounds were the low buzz of the neon sign outside and the frantic hiss from the grill. You know what? Tyler said, his voice dropping to a threatening murmur. I don't think you're sorry at all. I think you're an incompetent waitress with a terrible attitude. I think you need to learn some manners. Emma attempted to pull free, but his grip was unrelenting. Please, she whispered, her eyes beseeching. Please let go. It was the please that triggered it. That solitary word of submission seemed to inflate Tyler's ego to its rupture point. He released her wrist with a violent shove that sent her staggering backward. You heard the lady, he sneered to Marcus. She said please. And then he stood up. The vinyl booth groaned in relief. He advanced toward Emma, who was now pressed against the counter, her hands raised defensively. The other patrons were immobilized, a frozen tableau of horror. This was no longer simply harassment. This was a physical threat. And then, with a contemptuous sneer, Tyler drew back his hand and struck her across the face. The sound was impossibly loud. It wasn't a playful tap. It was a full-force, open-palmed blow that whipped her head sideways and sent droplets of saliva spraying through the air. A vivid scarlet handprint materialized on her cheek instantly. Emma released a small, strangled cry, more shock than pain, her hands flying to her burning face. Tears, scalding and instantaneous, pooled in her eyes. In that moment, she appeared. The universe inside the diner seemed to freeze. The coffee machine stopped percolating. The clock on the wall stopped its relentless march. Everyone held their breath, suspended in a moment of pure, undiluted wrongness. Tyler loomed over her, chest inflated like a conquering hero. That's for your attitude, he hissed. And that is precisely when the bell above the diner entrance chimed. The sound was so mundane, so incongruous in the wake of the violence, that every single person in the diner pivoted toward it. The door swung inward, admitting a surge of wind and rain, and a man stepped through the threshold. If you're drawn to stories where justice is served and the underdog finds their champion, make sure you subscribe to Bully Tales. We share stories like this one every single week, and you won't want to miss what unfolds next, ***. He was tall and powerfully built, silhouetted against the stormy darkness. He moved with an unnerving stillness, a predator's calculated precision. He wasn't simply walking. He was commanding space, his presence immediately altering the energy in the room. He wore desert camouflage fatigues, the fabric dusty and battle-worn, and a massive military-issue duffel bag was hoisted over his shoulder. His hair was trimmed military short, his jawline was carved from stone, and his eyes, a pale, glacial blue, swept the room in a single, comprehensive, analytical pass that absorbed everything. He registered the scene instantaneously, the paralyzed customers, the arrogant bully standing over a cowering figure. And then his gaze fixed on Emma, still cradling her face, tears cascading down her reddened cheek. And in that instant, the impassive mask of the warrior fractured. A flicker of something primal and dangerous flashed through his eyes, a tempest of recognition, protectiveness, and a frigid, concentrated fury. Behind him, a large Belgian Malinois, its coat darkened and soaked, padded silently into the diner. The dog immediately sat at his heel, its intelligent eyes also locked on the scene, a low, guttural rumble emanating from its chest, more sensed than heard. Tyler and Marcus, their swagger momentarily deflated by the abrupt entrance, rallied quickly. This was just one guy, a soldier, sure, but still just one guy. "What's your problem, man?" Marcus said, attempting to sound intimidating, though a nervous quaver betrayed him. "This is a private matter." The soldier didn't acknowledge them. His eyes remained fixed on Emma. He dropped his duffel bag to the floor with a heavy, definitive thud. The sound was a punctuation mark, a period at the end of their reign of terror. Emma, through her tears, looked up. Her eyes widened in disbelief, then flooded with a complex mixture of relief, shame, and a lifetime of shared history. Her voice, when it emerged, was a fractured whisper that carried through the silent diner. "Jackson. Jackson. Her older brother. The boy who had taught her to swim. Who had defended her from middle school bullies. Who had held her at their mother's funeral. The man who had departed this small town to become something more, something sharper and more lethal. A Marine Force Recon operator, home on leave. He had texted her from the highway saying he'd surprise her at work. He had no conception the surprise would be reciprocal. Jackson advanced one step, his combat boots making no sound on the linoleum floor. He finally shifted his gaze from his sister to the two young men who had harmed her. There was no shouting, no posturing. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, level, and colder than the winter tempest outside. It was a voice that guaranteed violence, it didn't threat. "Did you," he asked, each word falling like a hammer, "put your hands on my sister?" The oxygen evacuated the room. Tyler, attempting to reclaim his lost dominance, puffed out his chest. "Look, buddy, she was being a disrespectful little." He never completed the sentence. In a movement too rapid to properly track, Jackson eliminated the distance between them. He didn't charge, he flowed. One instant he was 10 feet away, the next he occupied Tyler's personal space. He didn't throw a wild punch. His left hand shot forward, not as a fist, but as an open-handed, rigid-fingered strike to the side of Tyler's neck, just above the collarbone. It was a precise, incapacitating blow, a technique engineered to shock the nervous system and neutralize an opponent instantaneously. Tyler's eyes bulged. He produced a strangled, rasping sound, his hands flying to his throat as he stumbled backward, gasping for air that wouldn't come. He collapsed to his knees, his face transforming to an alarming shade of purple. Marcus stared in horror for a split second. Then his fight-or-flight response, fueled by panic and foolishness, selected fight. He released a yell and lunged, swinging a wild, telegraphed haymaker toward Jackson's head. It was like observing a child attack a mountain lion. Jackson didn't block the punch. He deflected it with a casual, almost dismissive motion of his forearm, redirecting Marcus's momentum effortlessly. As Marcus stumbled forward, off balance, Jackson's right hand clamped onto the back of his neck with a grip that felt like tempered steel. Simultaneously, his left hand seized Marcus's punching arm. In one fluid, brutal motion, he utilized Marcus's own forward momentum to slam him face-first onto the Formica tabletop. The impact was sickening. The sound of Marcus's nose fracturing was a wet, splintering crack. The table, bolted to the floor, shuddered violently. Silverware and condiment bottles leaped and clattered. Marcus lay sprawled across the table, disoriented and groaning, a brilliant crimson stain spreading from his face onto the white Formica. The entire confrontation had consumed less than 5 seconds. Two bullies who moments earlier had felt like the most powerful men in the world were now broken and whimpering. Jackson stood between them, his breathing barely elevated. He looked down at Tyler, who was still wheezing on his knees, and then at Marcus, bleeding profusely across the table. There was no satisfaction in his expression, only a cold, professional evaluation. A task completed. He turned away from them as if they had already ceased to exist and walked to his sister. Emma was still trembling, her hands covering her mouth. The raw scarlet mark on her cheek stood out in stark relief against her ashen complexion. Jackson's demeanor transformed. The stone-faced operator vanished, replaced by a concerned, tender big brother. He reached out, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle, and cupped her face, his thumb carefully brushing the edge of the welt. "Hey, EMS," he whispered, using a childhood nickname she hadn't heard in years. "I'm here. You're safe now." At that, the dam burst. Emma collapsed into his arms, sobbing into the rough fabric of his uniform, her entire body convulsing with the release of terror and humiliation. He held her securely, a solid anchor in her shattered world. The Belgian Malinois, sensing the shift, patted over and nuzzled her hand with its wet nose, a soft whine in its throat. It was then that the wail of sirens pierced the night, growing rapidly louder. Miguel, the cook, from his vantage point at the grill, had summoned the police the second Tyler had grabbed Emma's wrist. Red and blue lights strobed through the rain-streaked windows, painting the diner. In pulses of emergency, 2 police officers, one veteran and weathered, one young and eager, entered the diner, hands hovering near their holsters. They absorbed the scene, the 2 battered jocks, the stone-faced soldier holding the weeping waitress, the frightened but now visibly relieved patrons. "All right, what happened here?" the older officer, Lieutenant Hayes, asked, his voice authoritative but measured. Tyler, finally finding a sliver of oxygen, pointed a trembling finger at Jackson. "He attacked us," he wheezed, his voice a ragged scrape. "For no reason. He's insane." Marcus, lifting his bloodied face from the table, mumbled agreement through his shattered nose. Lieutenant Hayes's eyes narrowed. He recognized Tyler and Marcus. He'd had several encounters with them before, minor infractions, public intoxication, disturbing the peace. He turned to Jackson. "Son, you want to give me your version?" Before Jackson could respond, a chorus of voices erupted from the surrounding booths. "It's not true," the young couple declared simultaneously. "Those 2 were tormenting Emma all night." "He slapped her," the trucker in the corner bellowed. "Right across the face." An elderly woman added, her voice trembling with righteous indignation, "That soldier was just defending his sister." Miguel, the cook, leaned through the service window, his face flushed with anger. "They assaulted my waitress, officer. I witnessed everything." "That young man there," he said, gesturing toward Jackson, "only finished what they initiated." Lieutenant Hayes listened, his expression darkening with each testimony. He approached Emma. "Emma, is this accurate? Did Tyler strike you?" Emma, still clinging to her brother, nodded, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. Jackson, his arms still protectively around his sister, slowly reached into a pocket on his fatigues. He didn't retrieve a weapon. He extracted a small leather wallet and handed it to the lieutenant. It wasn't a driver's license. Lieutenant Hayes opened it. Inside was a military ID, but it was the insignia and the designation that made his eyes widen almost imperceptibly. United States Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance. This wasn't merely a soldier. This was one of the most extensively trained, lethally proficient warriors on the planet. He had just dismantled 2 college jocks with the ease of a man brushing away gnats. It suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. The lieutenant returned the ID to Jackson with a slow, respectful nod. He then turned to his partner. "Cuff them," he said, jerking his head toward Tyler and Marcus. The younger officer appeared surprised. "Sir, they're the ones who are injured. They're the perpetrators of assault," Hayes stated firmly. "And from what I'm hearing, they received exactly what they deserved. Read them their rights." As the officers hauled a protesting, bleeding Marcus to his feet and pulled a still gasping Tyler up from his knees, Lieutenant Hayes turned back to Jackson. "You'll need to come to the station to provide a statement, but given the circumstances and the number of witnesses, I don't anticipate any charges being filed against you. This appears to be a textbook case of defense of another person." Jackson simply nodded. His attention remained entirely on his sister. He guided her to a booth, seated her gently, and fetched her a glass of water with steady hands. The other patrons, emboldened now, approached to offer their support to Emma, their voices a low, comforting murmur. They had been silent when she needed them most, and now their gratitude toward her brother was mingled with a collective sense of guilt. The police escorted Tyler and Marcus out into the rain, stuffing them into the rear of the patrol car. Their varsity jackets, symbols of their faded glory, were now stained with blood and rainwater. The T on their chests no longer stood for Titans. It stood for Terminated. Later, after the statements had been recorded and the diner had begun to empty, Jackson helped Emma into his pickup truck. The Belgian Malinois, a loyal sentinel named Thor, sat in the back seat. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle. Emma was quiet, gazing out the window at the passing streetlights. "I'm sorry you had to witness that, EMS," Jackson said, his voice soft. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." Emma shook her head, a small, melancholy smile touching her lips. "Don't be," she said. "You arrived exactly when you were supposed to." She looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing not just her brother, but the man he had evolved into. The man who moved with the stillness of a deep ocean and the swift, decisive force of a tsunami. "They had no idea," she whispered. Jackson kept his eyes on the road, the ghost of a smile on his own face. "They never do," he replied. The story of what transpired at the Midnight Haven spread through the small town like wildfire. It became a contemporary folk tale, a parable about the perils of mistaking kindness for weakness. Tyler and Marcus, once the town's golden boys, became pariahs. They were charged with assault and ultimately accepted a plea agreement that included community service, mandatory anger management courses, and restraining orders. They never harassed anyone in that diner again. In fact, they rarely showed their faces in town at all. Emma, empowered by the ordeal and her brother's unwavering support, discovered a new strength within herself. She didn't abandon her job, but she did learn to stand taller, to speak with more confidence. She understood now that she was never truly alone. And Jackson, the quiet warrior, spent the remainder of his leave with his sister, the two of them rebuilding the bond that distance and duty had stretched thin. He was a reminder that sometimes heroes don't wear capes. They wear combat boots and faded uniforms. And they appear in the most ordinary of places, like a rain-soaked diner at midnight, just in time to deliver a justice so swift and so absolute that it resonates long after the door has closed behind them. The world is populated with quiet people. But you never know who is standing in their corner, ready to answer the call. Before you go, if this story resonated with you, if you believe that bullies should always face consequences and that the overlooked deserve their moment of justice, subscribe to Bully Tales. We bring you stories like this every week, stories that remind us that courage comes in many forms and that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never denied, ****. It leaves us with just one question, a simple one. To all of you watching this story of an American town and a justice served, from which part of the country are you experiencing this tale?